describe him as a progressive Democrat. And to me, that is a badge of honor, to be a progressive Democrat. And the legislation that he has initiated in the state Senate addresses an issue that all of us have talked about from time to time, and that is Citizens United, and how much Citizens United has changed democracy, changed the impact that an individual voter's vote has on an election. And so I asked Jimmy if he would be our guest, and I think it took him and his staff about 10 minutes to make the decision, and he was happy to join us this evening. So let us welcome Senator Jamie Ellsworth.
Great, thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. And Paul, I want to thank you for inviting me. I saw Paul at the Framingham Democratic Town Committee holiday party just a few weeks ago, and I've been really, in a way, I guess, taking a tour around many parts of the state to talk about the Citizens United Supreme Court decision, which happened almost exactly 2 years ago, so January 2010. Are people familiar with the Citizens United decision? I think probably most people are, but very, very briefly, the decision, and it's important to realize this was sort of the tail end of really what's been a 30-year effort by conservative Republicans to sort of connect free speech as being about money, and also to sort of get corporate money and wealthy donors to be a bigger part of the campaign finance system, and therefore their conservative agenda. So the decision, which came out of a lawsuit involving this entity, Citizens United, that made a movie that was attacking Hillary Clinton, and they were trying to film this movie that really wasn't a movie. It was really a way to attack Hillary Clinton during the United States presidential race of 2008. But the decision said that corporations, through the legal concept that was established in 1976, that free speech being equated with money, and money being equated with free speech, that corporations therefore are able to spend from their general treasury funds in order to spend on campaigns. And just to make the point, it's not about donating to candidates, that federal and state restrictions still apply, but it's about a corporation deciding they want to influence a race and spending unlimited amounts of money to support or attack a candidate. And you've probably already seen this a lot in the Republican presidential primaries. You saw in Iowa where at the time Newt Gingrich was sort of surging, and then the super PAC that was affiliated, although I guess not really affiliated, with Mitt Romney, that spent millions of dollars to attack Newt Gingrich and ended up in a near victory for Mitt Romney in Iowa. And then you saw the money, how it was spent in South Carolina, and then most recently in Florida, and Nevada coming up, Nevada this past weekend. But I can't think of a more destructive force for sort of the basic fabric of democracy, and probably I don't have to go into too much detail to explain why, but I just want to give a bit of a perspective as a legislator. I've been a legislator for 10 years, for 6 years as a state representative, and 4 as a senator. And when I first ran, I was a clean elections candidate, publicly financed, and unfortunately I was the only clean elections candidate elected in Massachusetts in 2002, because the following year the legislature and Governor Romney repealed the law. But it was public financing, which I think is ultimately the purest and best way to get money out of politics, is public financing for all candidates. So we don't have that. We don't have that anymore. But I would just say that since then, I've done a fair amount of activity in sort of taking on certain corporate special interests. I just want to highlight a few bills and sort of why they don't rise to the top of the priority and pass, at least in my opinion. The first revolving health care, and I know Jim talked about health care and universal health care. I'm a proponent of universal single-payer health care, also known as Medicare for all. The basic idea of health care is a right. I'm proud of what Massachusetts has done in terms of expanding health care, but it's not health care as a right. It's far too expensive, and there's still far too many people who don't have quality health care and fall through the cracks. Well, that's a bill that's been filed for, probably 2 decades. And I think the major reason why it doesn't get brought up is the influence of health insurance executives, of their lobbyists able to spend money and raise money. The environment. I'm a big proponent of safer alternatives legislation, which is working with companies to remove toxic chemicals, consumer products that are in your house, that you buy, and really have a real negative effect on people's health. There's a lot of data out there already. This bill has been filed for about 10 years, and yet the large companies, especially some of the computer companies, continue to defeat this bill, which is really been worked to a very reasonable manner, and every year it gets basically put into study or not brought up for taken for a vote. Now, this is the state of affairs already, sadly, in the Massachusetts legislature and state government, is these bills that I think have broad support, not just even amongst Democrats, but among independents and among many Republicans, and yet they never see the light of day. So if that's the challenge we have in Massachusetts already, imagine the consequences of the Citizens United decision here in Massachusetts. And I think what you're going to see is you're going to see the effects of it this year. We're already seeing, as I mentioned, the effects of it in the presidential campaign in some of the other states with their caucuses or primaries. And you're going to see it, no doubt, in the U.S. Senate race. And you've seen that Elizabeth Warren and Scott Brown in some of the newspaper columns have been meeting to talk about how to eliminate or reduce the use of super PACs or independent money spent in campaigns. Well, that's a very good thing. I commend them for that. But at the end of the day, it's really not up to them. It's not up to any candidate, because any corporation, any wealthy individual can decide to spend money to influence a campaign. So I think this is going to have a very troubling effect. It's really going to drown out the voice of ordinary Americans that already struggle to get their voices heard, whether you're talking about the halls of Beacon Hill or you're talking about Capitol Hill. And what my concern is sort of twofold. Is first is that it has the potential to defeat good candidates. Of course, we're here at a Democratic meeting. I'm really concerned about how it could potentially defeat good Democratic candidates. And when I say that, it's not just about the presidential campaign, it's not just about the U.S. Senate race, but it's about state legislative races. And one of the things to think about is that legislators every year get asked to co-sponsor legislation, things like the bottle bill or progressive taxation. And if there is a company in one of our districts that might be opposed to that bill, say the bottle bill, where unfortunately 2 large companies are really leading the effort to oppose the passage of the bottle bill to bottle water and juices, Ocean Spray and Polar Beverage Company in Worcester. If one of those companies or some other company in high tech or alternative energy or biotech is opposed to that bill, it's going to be much more likely for that legislator or a candidate in that district to consider supporting that legislation out of the fear that the money could be spent in that election to defeat that candidate. And that has the second effect, the second biggest concern I have is the chilling effect. It's going to have a chilling effect on people willing to run for office, because it's already very, very difficult to raise money. And since the Clean Elections Law was repealed in 2003, I, like every other candidate in Massachusetts, has had to raise money privately. There's no doubt it's already very challenging. And if you look at some of the statistics for people running for U.S. Congress and U.S. Senate, these are incumbents. It's said that they spend 30 to 70% of their time raising money. So that's obviously at the federal level. But it's also somewhat disturbing at the state level. So put up against that a corporation's ability to spend money in an election, it's very disturbing. And I want to say that this isn't really an attack on corporations per se, but it's about the corporate structure, and it's about who's in charge. Because I think of a bill like the paid sick leave bill to require that any company provide paid sick leave to any employee in Massachusetts. Now, this is a bill that if you talk to probably most of the employees at any corporation, they would support it. The problem is the ability for a CEO to say this is against his or her best interests as they see the corporation short-term interest, what's in the interest of the shareholders or the stock market for that company. And they can decide unilaterally to spend money, millions of dollars, to attack a candidate who might support the paid sick leave or support the bottle bill or support universal health care or fair taxation. So it's that concentrated money that is really the concern here. So the resolution I filed is Senate 772. There's been an amazing grassroots effort by dozens of good government groups like Common Cause and MassPIRG and Public Citizen. The Democratic Party has been incredibly strong on this. And the polling is strong not only amongst Democrats but independents and Republicans. But just to sort of give you a vignette of where the parties, I think, at the end of the day will stand is New Mexico is poised this week to become the second state in the United States to pass this resolution, and I've handed out copies, so hopefully most of you have that resolution asking for our congressional delegation, our congressmen and women, our U.S. senators, to call for a constitutional amendment to change the Constitution to say that the First Amendment, just the First Amendment, under freedom of speech, is for persons and not for corporations. And it's an ambitious effort, but the problem is that the Supreme Court decision really doesn't allow us to change that by federal legislation. I think it really requires a constitutional amendment. Again, going back to this 30-year-old concept of money is free speech, which I disagree with, but it's really sort of a set decision now in the Supreme Court. So New Mexico is poised to be the second state. I'm hoping Massachusetts will be the third state. That's what the resolution is calling for. So I would ask for your support on it. The bill does have a hearing on February 28th at 1 p.m. at the State House. We're really calling on everyone to come. You don't necessarily have to testify, but just coming and being there and having a presence throughout the state really would make a big difference. The second thing is to ask your legislators, your state representative and state senator, many of whom are now signing on to the resolution, to sign on to the bill and maybe consider testifying. And then I just really quickly want to mention two sort of smaller bills that speak to the fact that although this is a Supreme Court decision, so it requires either federal legislation or a constitutional amendment, but there is action we can take at the state level. And there's two other bills that I've filed that are in a different committee in election laws. The one would require simple disclosure, which is just going to say that if corporations are going to spend money in elections going this year, and there's no doubt they're going to spend money in Massachusetts, I think in the presidential and the U.S. Senate, and I think this could easily happen at the legislative level, and even sort of the selectmen at city council level. You think of a selectman who opposes a development in a neighborhood, developer could easily spend $10 or $20 or $30,000 to influence an election. But this would require disclosure, so just as all the campaign funding that I spent in my campaign this year has to be disclosed to the Office of Campaign and Political Finance, corporations would also have to disclose that. So then we can get an idea of which corporations are spending money and hopefully apply a little public pressure, like just what recently happened with the Komen Foundation, a little public pressure to perhaps change a corporation's decision. So that's a bill that I filed in election laws for disclosure, hoping to get that into an election reform package before the end of this year, and I feel like there's some good momentum. And the second bill, which has a little bit more teeth, it's pushing back a little bit more, it would require the board of directors for any Massachusetts corporation, because we couldn't regulate any of those outside of it for state legislation, to require them to vote in order to allow the CEO to spend money in a campaign. And that's really to send a message and hopefully for us to influence the board of directors to say no when a corporate CEO is considering spending money in an election. And it would also require notice to all shareholders of that corporation, knowing that many of us have stock in corporations, and it's a way for us, again, to sort of influence that political process. So those are bills in election laws, but the main focus is this bill, which is in judiciary. For anyone who knows the Committee on Judiciary in the legislature, it's a little difficult to get bills out of that committee. So we're really hoping for a big turnout on February 28th. Again, I want to thank Paul for inviting me here today and for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions, and I would just say that, going into my 10th year now as a legislator, I can't think of an issue that has a bigger impact on the quality of our democracy, on the kind of legislation that we're going to pass in the legislature, but also the groundswell of support for this resolution. And I'm hoping we can all come together on the 28th and pass this, get this bill reported to committee. Thank you very much.
We have time for questions, right?
Yes, absolutely.
I have two questions about 772. First question is, where is resistance coming from? Is there any resistance, and if so, what are the sources of the resistance? And then my second question is, did you give any serious consideration to filing this and also filing a bill requesting a constitutional convention?
Sure. Well, in terms of your second question, a constitutional convention called by, by the states, including Massachusetts, I mean, that's just very unusual, so I haven't focused on that. I focus on trying to pass this resolution to get our congressional delegation on board. The lead in Massachusetts on this is Jim McGovern. He has filed a constitutional amendment on this subject, and I think that one or two congressmen have signed on to it, but most have not yet. So and I'm sorry, your first question?
Was where is resistance coming from?
Oh, yes.
Who doesn't want this?
Yes, well, actually, I mean, so far there hasn't been a lot of opposition, but as you sort of find at the State House, the opposition tends to be, quiet behind the scenes. So I'm curious to see if any sort of corporate lobbyists are quietly, arguing against this, but so far there hasn't been any public opposition.
Max?
I heard your presentation previously, and there were some people there who had some concerns, and I was trying to think about what their argument was getting at, and I was curious as to, the ACLU is a corporation, correct? So if we take away their rights to free speech, will the government be able to censor ACLU if they wanted to?
Sure, well, just to be clear, and you're right, there is some, and this is what happens with progressives, right? There's division amongst progressives on this resolution. But yeah, basically ACLU's perspective is that they...
any nonprofit.
Right, well, first of all, you have to consider is limiting the amount of money by any individual entity, whether a person or a corporation, is that censorship. I tend to see that there's a role in regulating that, because for to say that someone has unlimited amount of money to spend, has the same speech as perhaps any of us here in this room, I think is a little disingenuous. So I guess my answer to that is the ACLU, as a corporation would be limited, except that first of all they're not likely to spend money in campaigns, but second of all, should they or any other corporation have that ability to spend so much money in an election, is that bad for our democracy? No, this is just money being spent in elections.
Okay,
yeah.
so
Yep.
so outside of elections, it doesn't have an impact.
Right,
That's
and,
what-
and a red herring raised by some Republicans is, well, then what about labor unions? Well, if a labor union is incorporated, and some are, some aren't, then the same standard would apply to them as well. The labor union, just like any corporation, can give political action committee money, but that's regulated, that's limited by the state you're in. So I think that's reasonable, but for a corporation to spend, $5 million in a race, or this gentleman who he and his wife have donated $10 million to Newt Gingrich, I think that's way out of hand.
So corporations will still have free speech with regard to policy that doesn't involve elections.
Right, yep.
Beth?
Hey, thanks for doing this work, Jamie. It's really important.
Thank you.
And, my question is, aside from the money, which is, obviously a big concern, are there any kind of bills is it within your power to kind of do anything that has to do with truth and honesty? I mean, because the money is one thing, but the fact that the ability to say anything without truth and honesty is really what affects our democracy.
Well, you can mandate truth and honesty, but I mean the marketplace of ideas, including free speech. The argument is that the most number of people who feel strongly about something will have an influence, and the problem is that with the influence of corporate money, that really reverses that dynamic. So the ability to get the truth out of it will be much harder if corporations have this unlimited spending power. So if you're talking about sort of other election reform bills, I mean, there are bills to encourage and make it easier for people to vote, but that's probably not specifically addressing your question.
Al?
Jamie, again, thank you. Really, what Beth just says is great that you're doing this. I think we are in common agreement this is something that needs to be done. My question, I guess, is in two parts. I'm not familiar, as I should be, with the process. It requires a 2/3 vote, a supermajority of the House. First, you have, both houses, I'm sorry. First, you have any sense of what kind of support there is. We can't even get a majority to pass anything. Are we going to have any chance of getting 2/3? And is it subject to a filibuster in that process?
Yeah, I mean, this is absolutely gonna be difficult, and I would say two perspectives. The first is this resolution passing will get, hopefully more congressmen and women in Massachusetts that hopefully will get behind this. If we don't have support in Massachusetts, then I think we're in trouble for the rest of the country. Right, I'm just talking about the congressional delegation from Massachusetts. But it's certainly gonna be challenging, but if you look at all, the other constitutional amendments, whether you're, dealing with voting rights in the 1960s or, women's suffrage, at first glance, no one thought that, those measures would gain support and gain a constitutional amendment, but you have to start somewhere.
I don't need to ask another question, but because this is going to take such a long time, is anything to be done in the interim to help the process, not just get the process through, but to interrupt what's going on with what this has done?
Well, there was a federal bill, and I assume it's been filed again this past year, but it was the Disclose Act that would require disclosure for all corporations, sort of what I'm trying to do just here in Massachusetts. And interesting, that was a bill that Senator Brown voted against. So, this is where you see often the difference between Democrats and Republicans. So there is federal legislation, but in the end, that's more about disclosure. If you're really addressing the heart of the issue of, can a corporation, or an individual spend unlimited amounts of money, because that's a Supreme Court decision, in my opinion, you need a constitutional amendment.
Jeff?
One thing I'd ask if you could speak on is how this amendment would impact the freedom of the press. The New York Times, being a corporation, wants to publish an editorial endorsing a specific candidate, and wouldn't that also be spending money in advance of a campaign? And what impact would this type of an amendment have on the press to do that type of speech?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, that's been brought up. I guess I would say that I think of course, this decision was brought by a company that made this movie that was claiming that it was sort of essentially, a media story, but lower court determined that it was an effort to influence the presidential election because it was a movie attacking Hillary Clinton. So I guess what I would say to that is I believe that I have faith in the courts to distinguish between the press, the New York Times or a local newspaper, the media, and a corporation deciding to spend lots of money to influence an election. So I'd be the first to concede that will be difficult to interpret, but I have faith that the court can. But if we don't do something to address it, then these corporations will be able to spend money in elections in a way that I don't think is anything close to sort of printing an article or expressing free speech.
Jim?
Two comments. One, my concern has to do with the time in which disclosure is going to occur. One of the things that happened with Scott when he got some of his money was right near the end of the period, and so that disclosure of people really knowing who had contributed to his campaign did not come out in sufficient amount of time so that people could see who was doing that. So my hope is that there will be a cutoff and an amount of time that would allow that kind of exposure to occur. The second comment is that it's also locally this effect. I'll give you an example. I'm from Norfolk, previous selectman. We just finished with Foxborough in an issue regarding the casino that Kraft and Wynn wants to put in. Well, one of the selectmen changed their vote, and as a result, the selectmen did not allow it to move forward to town meeting. The comment back from Kraft and Wynn was they were now in the process of finding a candidate to be able to re-vote the question, support that candidate, and for a selectman, you don't have those kind of funds to compete against that kind of corporate money that's going to be coming at you. So here's an example, real local, influencing a large area, and these people who are trying to stand up and do what they feel is appropriate cannot. So I support your efforts. What I'm saying is that it needs to move real quick.
Absolutely, and I'm particularly glad I came tonight because now I can use that example of the local example of the troubling aspect of this, because whether or not another candidate is found, someone like Mr. Kraft or someone else who's head of a corporation can just spend money to attack a candidate, and that's deeply disturbing, especially at the local level.
I just have one comment, because I went to Clark University.
Oh,
and,
great.
I, of course, am learning all about this, and, but the book that was plugged that night,
Yes.
Corporations Are Not People, I'm almost through with it, and it's been a real eye-opener. And I just ordered 2 more copies from Barnes & Noble's, one I have to send to my daughter in college. But it's really got some incredible information on it, and it's, I took Barnes & Noble's less than 3 days to get it in. And so I went in there today to pick it up, but it's a wealth of information.
It is great. I've
Yeah, by
read
Jeffrey
it as well,
Clements.
and yeah, Jeff is an attorney from Concord,
Yeah.
and he and John Bonifaz, who's been a voting rights activist for decades, are both from Massachusetts. So
Yeah.
this effort really has started here in Massachusetts and
It's a
spread
real
across the
eye-opener,
country.
though.
Yeah. Thanks for coming that night.
Yeah.
Just as a suggestion, one of the things I've done over the past year and a half is write op-eds on public policy issues. I would say that if you have a strong opposition to this Citizens United, write your newspapers as much as possible. I mean, just get your voice out there and let your opposition be known. Educate the public. Newspapers are a great way to do that.
That's a great suggestion, and my editorial on this was in the Metro West Daily News a few days ago, so you can take a look at that discussion on that. Or I will say that perhaps the best education is towns across the state that have the town meeting form of government are passing this resolution at town meeting, just like I know the Alliance is considering this evening. So that's something to consider. My hometown of Acton, that's where I'm from, is considering a resolution for the spring town meeting.